I'll go ahead and get started. And when we get started here in just a moment, we'll be picking up in Second Kingdoms if you've got the Orthodox Study Bible, which is what I'm going to be reading from, or Second Samuel if you've got another Bible, pretty much any other Bible, chapter 17. But I want to do, because there's a month in between these Bible studies, do a little catch up, because I don't expect everybody to go and rewatch or re-listen to the last one before this one. I didn't even do that, so I can't expect you to. But we've been going through the life of the prophet and King David. We started out with David as a young man, as a shepherd. Now we're much later in David's life. So we are after David has become king, not only of Judah, but of all of Israel. He's captured Jerusalem and made it his capital. He's moved the Ark of the Covenant there permanently. Well, it's not still there, but on a more permanent basis. Of course, it's his son who's going to build the temple. So David had become sort of fully established in his rule. We've also read about his fall into sin with Bathsheba, where he essentially had her husband murdered to cover up the adulterous affair he had with her that had caused her to become pregnant. And then we read about David's repentance afterwards when confronted about it. But in the last few Bible studies, we've seen some of the consequences of the way David has lived his life. We've seen the consequences of the positive, obviously, but also the consequences of some of the negative elements of how he's lived his life and the choices he's made start to play themselves out. We saw even very early in David's story that while in terms of his public life, he was very committed to following God, to keeping his commandments, to doing what was right, to being obedient. In his private life, particularly as it regards marriage, where he had started to accumulate several wives very early and then continued to add more. He also, as we've seen, has taken concubines, which we shouldn't. Concubine has become kind of a euphemism. What it really means is a sex slave. It's a slave that you have for the purpose of servicing your sexual appetites. David is certainly not unique among kings for doing this, but the point of the scriptures is that he was supposed to be unique among kings. He was not supposed to be like all the other kings of all the other nations. And in particular, not in this particular way. And so it's not only the affair with Bathsheba, who eventually became another of his wives, but this whole pattern of not being disciplined and controlled and not following God's commandments in relation to his intimate life. And that we've seen has turned into kind of a crisis, because being the king and having all of these wives means he has this giant household of sons and daughters by various wives who are all living together and jockeying for power and authority and influence. We saw how, and I'll try to be as non-graphic as possible with a lot of this, but we saw how one of his sons by one of his wives ended up raping one of his daughters by another wife, so his half-sister, and how her brother, Absalom, then took revenge. David sort of tepidly reconciled with Absalom, and by reconciled we mean he didn't kill him, for having killed his half-brother. But David did not, the reason Absalom was motivated to do that was that David hadn't exercised his authority as a father and as the king to resolve the situation, because it was his oldest son, the heir, who had done this thing. And so he showed this favoritism, and that allowed this sort of wound to fester. And that festering wound has now sort of become an open sore, in that Absalom, that same son, has now staged a coup. And David has had to flee Jerusalem. We talked about this last time. As David was fleeing Jerusalem, we saw he had a couple of haters following him along the road and hurling insults at him. We saw how David, though, has approached this very differently to how he's approached things in the past, in that this time David has this awareness from the life of repentance he started leading, that what's happening to him now, having to go on the run from his own son, all of this chaos, has its root in his own sin. And so he's now repentant of it, and he's willing to accept the consequences, whatever they may be, of what he's done and how he's lived his life and how he's conducted his family affairs until now. At the very end, and again, I'll try to be delicate about this, at the very end of chapter 16, Absalom had sort of finished off his coup by having taken Jerusalem and set himself up as king. He and one of his advisors made a very public show of Absalom having intercourse with some of David's concubines, which was a way in the ancient world both of sort of usurping the position of the father of the household, also a way of usurping a kingdom and sort of humiliating his father David, and publicly humiliating him and embarrassing him. So that's where we left off last time, in a fairly dark place. And I wish I could tell you things were going to get rosier tonight, but they're not really. But so unless anybody has any questions or comments or late breaking news stories or anything else to report or ask, we'll go ahead and pick up at 2 Kingdoms or 2 Samuel 17, verse 1. In those days, Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Let me choose for myself 12,000 men, and I will arise and pursue David tonight. I will come upon him while he is weary and weak and make him confused. And all the people who are with him will flee, and I will strike only the king. I will bring all the people back to you as a bride returns to her husband, except the life of the one man whom you seek. Then all the people will be at peace." The saying pleased Absalom and all the elders of Israel. We have a quick question that I'll answer about how David knew to flee. He knew Absalom was coming. He had a report that Absalom was coming and this coup was coming, and so he got out of the way. And now, as we're seeing in the first verses of chapter 17, Absalom still isn't content with what he's done. Ahithophel has been Absalom's sort of right-hand man and main advisor so far, and he says, you know, as long as your father David is out there, right, there are going to be people who are loyal to him. This could end up turning into a civil war. You don't want that, right? So he says, I'll go and take 12,000 men. I'll get together a big group of men. We'll go and chase after David while he's still on the road, while he's still fleeing, before he has a chance to hunker down somewhere, before he has a chance to set up defenses or make a deal with somebody for protection. We'll go after him on the road. Ahithophel is saying, at least, I'll only kill David, right? We'll just kill David. He's the only problem. Once he's gone, right, then there won't be any other claimants to the throne. Absalom can reign as king. Ahithophel's claiming, at least, then there will be peace. You notice, though, not only does Absalom agree to the assassination of his father and approve it, but we're told that the elders of Israel agree to it. We haven't been told anywhere that Absalom went and got rid of the previous elders of the different tribes, right? The elders of Israel is this group that later in the New Testament be called the Sanhedrin, that consisted of basically 6 of the main elders, the heads of clans from the 12 tribes. So it was a group of 72, between 70 and 72 people. You know, there's variables, things happen. But representing all the tribes, we're not told that Absalom sort of got rid of all of the ones who are loyal to David and appointed new ones. So the way the text presents it, these are the same people who had been part of David's court as elders and advisors, and they apparently are not only perfectly fine with Absalom taking over, but they're perfectly fine with David now being assassinated. So David has very few friends. We saw he escaped with a few. He told a couple of friends. He told the high priest, and he told another of his servants to go back to sort of insert themselves into Absalom's regime so they could sort of help David and tell David what's going on. We'll see one of them return here in just a moment. But David doesn't have a lot of friends. The people with power, the people who have authority in Israel, are all perfectly fine with moving on to Absalom and getting rid of David. There's not a lot of loyalty. David has just sort of been rejected. And I'll go ahead and say this here. I've said this several times along the way, but I'm going to reiterate it again here that David, remember, is the beginning of this dynasty that we're going to see. He and his son Solomon, and then when the kingdom splits, David's dynasty is going to continue in the southern kingdom of Judah. And that's the dynasty that's going to produce the Messiah. That's why everyone says that, refers to Jesus as son of David, for example, in the Gospels, right? He's part of this Davidic dynasty. That's what makes him the Messianic king. And so part of where the sort of profile for the Messiah, the idea of who the Messiah is and is going to be, comes from the life of David that we've been reading. So David is sort of an icon beforehand of Christ. He's sort of an image of the Messiah. Obviously not a perfect one, right? We've seen David has his problems and his sins. We've also seen the power of David's repentance, but that's obviously a place where he's different than Christ. But he is still sets this sort of pattern, this sort of image or form or icon of who the Messiah is going to be. And repeatedly in the Gospels, Christ has to sort of correct his disciples and correct other people about the Messiah, because there's sort of this pervasive idea they have that when the Messiah comes, he's going to show up and raise an army and get rid of the Romans and reestablish sort of an independent kingdom of Israel on earth, and maybe enslave a bunch of Gentiles to pay them back for having enslaved the Israelites and the Judeans. But this is sort of their view, and that view is not based on David. That view is based on someone named John Hyrcanus, who lived around 150 BC. He was part of the Maccabean dynasty. So if at some point you read 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which is an unfortunately little read section of our Orthodox Old Testament, you can read about him. But he was essentially a warlord who also served as high priest at the same time. He was king and high priest at the same time, which you weren't supposed to do, of course. But he went and conquered a lot of territory, maintained an independent Judea. He's the one who destroyed the Samaritans' temple. And so the Maccabean dynasty had come out of this revolt against the Greeks. And so that was sort of the image that a lot of the people around Christ during his earthly life had of who the Messiah was going to be. He was going to be another sort of warlord like that, who's going to rise up and reestablish their political independence, and also be a priest who reestablished temple worship. But of course, the scriptures always held out David. And so when Christ corrects them, he will say, for example, did you not know that the Messiah must suffer all of these things and then enter into his glory? He speaks over and over again about the Messiah suffering, the Messiah being rejected, the Messiah being outcast, which ran against their idea of the Messiah, but doesn't really run up against the Old Testament scriptures, which is why Christ also usually in that context says, haven't you read the scriptures, right? And haven't you read what is written? David actually goes through this kind of cycle twice in his life. We've already talked about one of those, when he had to go on the run from Saul, when Saul was trying to murder him. And he had to flee and spent years going from place to place, but refused to sort of fight back directly against Saul, refused to take up arms against Saul or kill Saul, even when he had the chance. And now we're seeing sort of a second cycle. We're in the midst of this second cycle where David is being rejected by the elders of the people, by the priests, by a usurper king. They've all sort of rejected him. He has no friends, and he's on his own. And we're going to see this situation isn't going to last forever. But David himself, if David is the icon of the Messiah, and David was not sort of beloved by all the people, it's sort of warmly welcomed and supported by everyone, right? Why would we expect that that would be true of the Messiah, of whom he's the icon? So this is one of the, what we're reading right now is one of the places in Scripture where people should see and should have seen this image that the fact that the Messiah is more perfect, right? That Christ is more perfect than David, that he is the true king, that he's God himself, didn't mean and wouldn't mean and doesn't mean that everyone is just going to immediately come on board and love him and think that he's wonderful. In fact, on a number of people it has the opposite, exactly the opposite effect. So David is not only an icon of Christ in terms of being the king and reigning in Jerusalem and these things, he's also an icon of Christ in his sufferings and in his rejection. And so this is true not only of the relationship between David and Christ, but also then of the relationship between Christ and us. That if our Christian life is about us becoming more like Christ, of us being formed into the image of Christ, that doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to be rich and powerful and successful at everything we do and beloved by everyone. That the reality is, if we're imaging Christ, then we're also going to face suffering, loneliness, rejection, temptation, right? That's going to happen to us just like it happened to David, just like Christ faced those sufferings. And so when we suffer things and when we fail and when we fall and when we struggle and when we're tempted, that's not the opposite of being close to Christ. That is being close to Christ. We share the fellowship of his sufferings, and we hope one day to share in the fellowship of his glory. But so we're seeing this pattern play out right now, again, for the second time, maybe more intensely now even, in David's life. Okay, so Absalom has agreed to the plan. The elders have agreed to the plan. Go find David and assassinate him while he's still on the run and isn't able to defend himself. Verse 5, then Absalom said, call Hushai the Archite, and let us hear what he says as well. When Hushai came to Absalom, Absalom spoke to him, saying, Ahithophel spoke in this manner. Shall we do as he says? If not, speak up. Okay. So Hushai, this is a reminder from last time, Hushai was a servant of David who sort of begged David to come with him into exile. But who David said, no, go back, right? Be publicly repentant, serve Absalom, and do what you can to help me and inform me of what's going on in Jerusalem while I'm in exile. So Hushai managed to do that. He still has this good reputation as a chief steward, and so Absalom decides to consult him as well and get his opinion sort of in the mix as to whether he should carry out this assassination plan. Verse 7, so Hushai said to Absalom, the advice that Ahithophel gave is not good at this time. Hushai said, you know that your father and his men are very mighty and bitter in their souls, like a bear robbed of her cubs in the field, or like a savage boar in the pasture. And your father is a man of war and will not camp with the people. Surely by now he is hidden in one of the hills or in some other place. And when at first some of them are overthrown, whoever hears it will say, there is a slaughter among the people who follow Absalom. And even he who is valiant, whose heart is like that of a lion, will melt completely. For all Israel knows that your father is a mighty man, and those who are with him are valiant men. Therefore I advise all Israel to gather to you from Dan to Beersheba, like the multitude of sand along the sea, and you yourself standing in the midst of them. So we will come upon him in one of the places where we may find him, and we will fall on him as the dew falls on the ground, and we will not leave one of all the men with him. Moreover, if he withdraws into a city, then all Israel shall bring ropes to that city, and we will pull it into the river until not one small stone is left. So Hushai does a little bit of shucking and jiving, right? That he gives a number of excuses why this is a bad idea, some of which conflict with each other. So Hushai says, right, this is a bad idea because look, they're going to be really angry. They're going to be really angry and bitter. And if you come out, they're going to be angry. There could be an attack. There could be a battle. Things could get ugly. You don't want that, right? Remember, the plan was just to kill David, but this whole thing could turn into an ugly mess. And you know what? I mean, it's been a while, so he's probably hunkered down someplace. He's probably hiding, and you won't be able to find him. He'll get warning. As soon as your troops come near his people, he'll get a warning and he'll take off. Innocent people might get killed. And if innocent people get killed, that'll cause a big uproar because people will hear about it and they'll hear, Absalom went and murdered a bunch of innocent Israelites, and then they'll turn on you, so you don't want that either. And so finally he says, here's what you should do, right? Don't just send somebody off after him right now while he's on the road. You need to get everybody together, right? You need to get the whole Israelite army. This wasn't all a standing army, right? So when it says gathering all of Israel from Dan to Beersheba, Dan was the farthest city north, Beersheba was the farthest city south in Israel at this time. And so he's saying, you got to get everybody, you got to call up all the reserves, get all the militias, right? Get everybody together, all the troops, right? And then go find David, right? And then, if you've got that big of an army, and he uses this kind of, now obviously it's not literal, right? Hey, even if he's hiding in a city, if you have that many people, you could just throw ropes around the city and throw it in the river, right? There'll be no way he can stand against you then. You'll have everybody. It'll be this big official move. You'll have everybody on board, everybody together. Now, of course, what's that going to require for him to do that? That's going to require a whole lot of time. That's going to take months, right? That's going to literally take this huge amount of time. So Hushai's goal here is to buy David as much time as he possibly can. He doesn't want these sort of 12,000 elite troops going out with Ahithophel and going in and killing him on the road, right? He wants to give him as much time as possible. And this is a good way to do it And everything he's just said to Absalom, none of that sounds traitorous. None of that sounds like he's trying to help David, right? But it will have the effect of buying David all this time and helping him. So verse 14, so Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the advice of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel. For the Lord commanded we reject the good counsel of Ahithophel, if perchance the Lord might bring all evil upon Absalom. So Absalom hears this, he talks to the other elders, and he says, you know what, that's good advice. Hushai's advice is good. It's better than the advice Ahithophel was giving me, because we don't want, we've got to play this carefully, right? That's what he's talking about with not wanting all evil to be brought on him, right? He's saying we need to be careful right now how we handle this, what we do. It's a delicate time. He's just committed a coup, right? So needs to handle this just right. And so he decides Hushai is right. Probably part of that being, hey, this will give us more time to put a plan together. We don't need to rush into anything right now, which of course is going to end up benefiting his father David. Verse 15, then Hushai the Archite said to Zadok and Abiathar the priests, thus and so Ahithophel advised Absalom and the elders of Israel, and thus and so I have advised. Now quickly send and tell David the following. Do not remain lodged this night in Araboat of the desert wilderness. Make haste and go quickly, lest perchance one swallow up the king, and with him all the people. So Hushai goes to David's the two other people who we know are loyal to David, the high priest and another of the priests, Zadok being the high priest, and says, hey, here's what's going on. Here's what they're planning. They're planning to go kill David. I gave them this advice to try and buy him some time, but you need to go now and get word to David of what's going on and tell him, hey, don't bed down, keep going, right? Get as far away as you can, and because they're coming for you. And of course, he's not doing this himself, because if he disappeared out into the wilderness, that would give away potentially his loyalties, whereas the priests can travel a little more freely and be a little more unquestioned, right? Because they have this position of authority, their own authority. They're not sort of servants of the king. They'll be able to travel freely to get that warning to David. Verse 17, now Jonathan and Ahimaaz stood by the well at Rogel, awaiting a handmaid to report to them. Then they would go and tell King David, for they dared not be seen coming into and going out of the city. Okay. So Jonathan and Ahimaaz are two of David's people. They are worried about being seen by Absalom, being notified. So they're waiting outside the city by this well. They're out a ways. And so presumably the plan would be for the priests to come to them out at the well, let them know, and then they're going to literally run, because that's how messages were delivered at this time, run to David and deliver the message. So they're out there at a distance, just kind of hanging around this well, trying to be incognito. Nevertheless, a lad saw them and told Absalom. But the two men went away quickly and came to a man's house in Bahurim. He had a reservoir for water in his court, and they went down into it. Then the woman spread a covering over the opening to the pit, and she put grain on it in need of drying to disguise what was happening. Okay, so somebody spots them, says, hey, I think they're loyal to David, runs and tells lets Absalom know. Absalom sends men after them. They find out they've been spotted, right? So they run to a nearby city and hide, and they hide down in this water reservoir. And the man who owns its wife sort of spreads these coverings out and hides them. And this should, hopefully, if folks are familiar with the book of Joshua, and before that, Numbers and Deuteronomy, should remind people of Rahab, the prostitute, who hid the two spies, the two Israelite spies, in Jericho when they came to scout the land. So this is a similar kind of thing. This woman hiding these two men, and this is a very subtle, sort of literary way of telling us that, remember, the spies who are hidden were sort of God's agents, and so the fact that they were protected was sort of then brought blessings to Rahab. In the same way, this is a subtle way of telling us that whose side God is still on, because we haven't seen a prophet show up recently. We've seen this sort of bloody mess. We've seen David taking responsibility for it. We've seen both sides sort of throwing God's name around in terms of who he favors. But this is a subtle way that the author of Second Kingdoms or Second Samuel is cluing us in that David's spies are sort of like God's spies, meaning God is still on David's side despite the hardship he's going through. He hasn't rejected David like Saul. Absalom does not have God's favor and is not the legitimate king. So the two men are hiding in this reservoir. And when Absalom's servants came to the woman at the house, they said, "Where are Ahimaaz and Jonathan?" So the woman said to them, "They passed a while ago for water." The men searched but found no one and returned to Jerusalem. After they departed, the two men came up out of the pit and went on to tell King David. They said to David, "Arise and quickly cross over the water, for thus did Ahithophel counsel concerning you." So the water they're talking about is the River Jordan. So they successfully hide. The woman gives an excuse. The soldiers come in. "Hey, where are the two of them?" Said, "Oh, they stopped here and got water," but then they kept going. They search around, don't find them. So the two of them are able to run back to David and let him know, "Hey, you need to keep going. So cross the Jordan River, go out into the desert, go out into the wilderness, because they're intending to find you and assassinate you." Verse 22, so David and all the people with him arose and crossed over the river Jordan before morning light. Not one of them was left who did not cross over the river Jordan. And when Ahithophel saw that his advice was not followed, he arose and saddled a donkey and went to his house in the city. He gave final orders to his household, and he hanged himself and died. He was buried in his father's tomb. So that's kind of an extreme reaction to somebody not taking your advice, right? I mean, I could see maybe sending an angry tweet or something, but, going and basically committing suicide because somebody took someone else's advice and not yours seems extreme. So why would he do this? And I know people haven't gone back and listened to the last few or read the last few chapters, but Ahithophel's kind of a shady figure already. Ahithophel is basically still alive and still around, and still a mover and shaker because of his relationship with Absalom. he has to know because of the things he's counseled Absalom to do, including sort of publicly humiliating his father with his father's concubines, that if David ends up coming back to the throne, he's dead, right? He's dead. And if he's sort of publicly executed for treason against the king and for what he did, then everything he owned would be seized and given to someone else. Now, so his sort of key hope was, okay, this Absalom thing has to work for Ahithophel. If this Absalom thing, if this coup doesn't work, if Absalom doesn't become and stay king, I'm done for. This is bad. And so what just happened when Absalom chose to take someone else's advice over his, that means two things. Number one, presumably he thinks it's bad advice. That it's basically letting David get away, which increases the chances that this whole Absalom thing isn't going to end up working out. But secondly, it also means that this formerly very close relationship with Absalom isn't what he thought it was, right? Because previously, everything he sort of advised Absalom to do, Absalom immediately did. He was sort of the power behind the throne, the one motivating this. And now that's clearly not the case. Now Absalom isn't trusting and relying on him in the same way, which means not only is he, if David ends up coming back to power, is he done for? Or if one of Absalom's brothers ends up overthrowing Absalom, he's done for. But he can't even count on Absalom to protect him in a general sense. And so what he's doing here is the important part in what we just read in terms of explaining it is that he gave those final instructions about the disposition of his property, his land, his family, his possessions. Again, it's extreme, and obviously it's deeply wrong and deeply sinful, like the way Ahithophel has lived most of his life. But by killing himself here, after taking care of the disposition of his property, he's at least protected his property and his family and his household possessions and made sure that those are going to stay intact and go to other people. Because with him dead, no one's going to come after his other family and clan members looking for revenge. He knows David isn't that type of person, right? And if Absalom's overthrown by someone else, they're not going to come looking for Ahithophel's family. There's no reason to. And so that's why Ahithophel does this thing that he does here. And, if you're thinking parallels, which hopefully you are from what I said before, there's a definite parallel in the way he kills himself and Judas. He's the one who really pushed this from Absalom being bitter and angry to treason, to becoming a full-on traitor, and betrayed David. And even this pattern where he sort of settles his accounts, like Judas throwing the money back. There's a deliberate sort of parallel there where, again, these things in David's life are an icon of who the Messiah, who the Christ is going to be. But Ahithophel lives this dark life of sort of treachery and dirty dealing, and it's not a coincidence that kind of life ends the way his life does here, as we just saw. I wish we were reading more upbeat passages, but it's gonna be a little bit before things start looking good again. Verse 24, David went through the desert wilderness to Mahanayan, while Absalom crossed the Jordan, he and all the men of Israel with him. Absalom appointed Amasa captain over the army instead of Joab. Amasa was the son of a man whose name was Jethro, an Israelite, who had gone into Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, sister of Zeruiah, Joab's mother. Okay. So that was convoluted. But so Absalom has taken this advice. It's bought David time to escape out into the wilderness. Joab's gathered up the whole army of Israel, but he clearly doesn't trust Joab. We've seen Joab to not be an entirely trustworthy figure. We've also seen him do a lot of David's dirty work, whether David necessarily wanted him to or not. He's the one who's very quick to take someone's life if it's morally expedient. But he was also sort of a brilliant military tactician, which is part of why David, even when David's gotten angry at him for going a little too far, has kept him in charge of the military. So Absalom doesn't trust Joab because of Joab's past relationship with David. So he appoints this other man to be his commander. And even here, you see that he feels this need to, this bitterness and anger and resentment towards his father comes out. Because when he goes to choose someone else to lead the military, he basically chooses someone who has humiliated Joab. So Joab's David's commander. Well, we're getting rid of him. You know what? I'm going to find someone who will be humiliating for him to replace him. And so he chooses this man whose father had this gone into here is implying, even though they didn't have the same concept of consent in the ancient world, unfortunately, that we do now, it's implying that he violated sexually Joab's mother, this man's father. So the son of a man who violated Joab's mother has now been appointed to replace him as the head of the military. And this is, again, clearly sort of a humiliating, kind of grotesque act by Absalom of sort of spite towards his father and anyone associated with his father. So all Israel and Absalom camped in the land of Gilead. Now when David came to Mahanayan, he was met by Shobi the son of Nahash from Rabbah of the sons of Ammon, Machir the son of Amiel from Lodabar, and Barzillai the Gileadite from Rohalim. They brought 10 beds and tapestries, 10 basins, earthen vessels, wheat, barley, flour, parched grain, beans, lentils, parched seed, honey and butter, sheep and cheese of the herd. And they offered them to David and the people with him to eat. For they said, the people are hungry and weary and thirsty in the desert. So it's intended that we see the certain irony here. David is, of course, the king of Israel, the rightful king of Israel. The Israelites have seemingly all turned on him, but he receives hospitality from these people. And I know, you may have been thinking as I was reading all those names, easy for me to say. But these are people from various sort of Bedouin areas, meaning these would have been Ishmaelites and Edomites and Midianites. So these are people not unrelated to the Israelites. They're not sort of outright Gentiles, right? So this isn't like Greeks showing up or something, or even Syrians. These are sort of related peoples, but they come and they give all of these things, which is not opulent, but it's the best that they had as desert Bedouins. They come and try and offer hospitality to David and comfort to him and to the people who are with him, while his own people have rejected him. And hopefully you're continuing to see some parallels between David as icon and Christ in terms of being rejected by the majority of his own people, but then being embraced by some from foreign lands. So chapter 18. David considered the people with him and set captains of thousands and captains of hundreds over them. Then David set out 1/3 of the people under the hand of Joab, 1/3 under the hand of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the hand of Ittai the Gathite. Just as a pause, you may remember Ittai, you may not. That's he's a Gathite. That means he's a Philistine. But remember, David spent some time among the Philistines when he was on the run from Saul, and so Ittai is one of David's sort of loyal men from that period. So even though he's originally from Gath, the Philistine city, he's now become part of Israel through his covenant and his bond with David. So David says, okay, they're coming after me. He's got this crowd of people with him. It's not really an army. And the language here is, again, a reference to make us think back, because when Moses had the people out in the wilderness before they crossed the Jordan into the land, this language of appointing rulers of tens and hundreds and thousands is language that was used for how Moses organized the people. So David doesn't really have an army, but he takes the people he has, at least the men he has who can fight, and he sort of organizes them. And the few of his men who are with him, he sort of sets in charge, his most trusted men, in charge of them, because he's thinking this may come down to a fight, and so we're gonna work with what we have. David said to the people, I myself will surely go out with you as well. But they answered, you shall not go out, for if we flee away, they will not care about us, nor will they care about us if half of us die. You are worth 10,000 of us, and now it is well that you will be more help to us in the city. So David says to them, presumably because, again, they're not an army, he says, I'm going to be in there with you. I'm going to be out there on the field with you. I'm going to be fighting beside you. They say to him, don't, right? They say that it's a bad idea. They're coming to get you, right? So that's what they mean when they say, right, if we flee, if we end up taking off, they only really care about killing David. So if these people flee and take off, they won't chase them, right, if David's not with them. And, they say, hey, if a bunch of us end up dying, right, at least you as the king will still be around. So this is, even though it's a small group, this small group has this intense love for David, where they're willing to lay down their lives for him. So they say, you get out of here, right, and we'll try to hold them off and delay them and do what we can to protect you. Verse 4, then the king said to them, I will do whatever seems best to you. So the king stood beside the gate, and all the people went out by hundreds and by thousands. The king commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, saying, for my sake, deal gently with the young man Absalom. And the people heard the king give orders to all the captains concerning Absalom. So here again, we haven't seen as much of David in what we've been reading tonight as the last couple of Bible studies. But here we see again where David's heart and mind are concerning this, where we've seen Absalom has this horrible bitterness and anger against David. And David is not showing that at all in return. Absalom is still his son. He still loves his son, despite everything that's happened. And as we saw in the last Bible study, David even accepts a lot of the blame for what's happened, right? That it was because he didn't do what he needed to do as a father that all of this is sort of unfolding in his family. And so he doesn't want vengeance against Absalom, just the opposite. So he tells his commanders, this deal gently with him is basically don't kill him. Whatever happens, don't kill him. Capture him, put him to flight, whatever, but don't kill my son. Verse 6, so the people went out into the thicket against Israel, and the battle was in the thicket of Ephraim. So thicket here is an interesting translation. The word is more like forest, but of course, this place in the world, it's not a forest the way we think of forests. So it's not brush, there's trees, but this is sort of scrabble and trees. And so I guess thicket kind of works. That's if you imagine sort of a forest of dry, twisted brush and that kind of thing, because there's not a lot of water, we're out in the desert. That's the idea. That's where the two groups of forces converge. That's where David's people end up running into Absalom's army, is in the midst of this thicket that's within the territory of Ephraim. The people of Israel were overthrown there before the servants of David, and a great slaughter of 20,000 men took place there that day. And the battle itself was scattered over the face of all the countryside, and the thicket of woods devoured more of the people that day than did the sword. So that's where they meet, and we're very much intended to see this as miraculous, right? We've got this sort of ragtag group of people loyal to David going into this thicket to go up against Israel's whole army. And you would expect them to all get slaughtered. You know, you'd expect this to be sort of like Thermopylae and the Spartans, where, you know, David's people get slaughtered, but it gives David time to get away, right? But that's the opposite of what happens. Miraculously, David's men are victorious to the point that they do real damage and put to flight the army of Israel. But that last note is, again, intending to signal to us that God is on David's side, right? Because it's not just this ragtag group of sort of militiamen who David has, who puts the army of Israel to flight, but sort of the natural elements, the trees, the thicket itself, is sort of fighting on David's behalf, right? That the army of Israel is falling prey to it while David's men are not. And so this is a signal that David is still the rightful king, and he still has God's blessing. Then Absalom met the servants of David. Absalom rode on his mule. The mule went under the thick boughs of a great oak tree, and his head caught in the oak, so he was left hanging between heaven and earth. And the mule that was under him went on. So it's clearer in the Hebrew than the Greek. We already had earlier on, I think it was 2 Bible studies ago, this reference to the weight of Absalom's hair. That was part of this description of Absalom, and sort of why people would have gone along with his coup, that he's this very tall, very good looking, very striking guy, and he has this incredible head of hair. I think we made Fabio comparisons, but I'm going to have to find another comparison, because I think Fabio is only known by old people like me now. But he has this sort of incredible head of hair, long hair. And so when David's men come up to where Absalom is, Absalom says, "Oh, I need to get out of here," obviously. So he jumps on his mule to take off. He's riding through the thicket. This incredible head of hair gets tangled, and his head gets caught in the branches of this tree. The mule, being unhelpful, keeps running, so he's sort of stuck. He's not hanging like choking, but he's stuck hanging in this tree. As you can imagine, if you have your weight hanging from your hair tangled in a tree and your head's caught in the tree, that's not something you're going to be able to very quickly or easily extract yourself from. So he's sort of stuck under this tree, and he's helpless. Now a certain man saw it and told Joab, saying, I just saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree. So Joab said to the man who told him, you just saw him and did not dislodge him so he could fall to the ground? Why? I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a belt. So he goes, this person sees, oh, hey, Absalom's caught over there, and he runs over and tells Joab, hey, guess what? Absalom's over there hanging, stuck in a tree. Joab says, well, why didn't you let him down? Dummy. Why'd you run over here? Right? I would have given you a reward, for helping him. Right? So Joab is at least signaling to this person that he was intending to follow David's order and spare Absalom. Verse 12, but the man said to Joab, though I were to receive 1,000 shekels of silver in my hand, I would not raise my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, protect the young man Absalom for me. Do not deal with his life in a dishonorable way, for there is nothing hidden from the king, and you yourself would have set yourself against him. So he tells Joab, look, I heard what David said about any harm coming to his son. I want nothing to do with this, right? I'm not trying to do nothing. I'm not getting involved. You can't pay me enough to get involved. I'm out of this. Whatever happens, whatever you do, right? I'm out. And he tells Joab, you better not do anything, because we all heard, right, what David said. Then Joab said, I will make preparation for this, and thus I will not linger with you. Which is, again, a weird trick. I will make preparation for this. That's what he's really saying is more like, I'll take care of this. I'll resolve this situation. I'll take care of this. So I'm going to go take care of this. I don't have any more time for you. Buzz off. Right? Joab took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them through the heart of Absalom while he was yet alive in the grip of the oak tree. Then 10 young men who bore Joab's armor surrounded Absalom and struck and killed him. So Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing Israel, for Joab spared the people. So Joab does exactly what he's not supposed to do, right? He goes and not only puts 3 spears through Absalom's chest, but then these people, his armor bearers, we talked about when David was an armor bearer for Saul. These armor bearers are sort of his immediate lieutenants and assistants. If you think about a general, right, a military general, he has junior officers around him who assist him and help him. That's who these people are. So when Joab finishes putting the 3 spears into Absalom, the idea is that they all surround him and basically beat him to death. So Absalom meets a very, very violent end here, going directly against what David said he wanted. Why would Joab do this? Well, he's kind of given a little bit of an out here in the text, in that after he does that, he blows the horn to signal that the battle is over. And, maybe he did it because he thought he would save the rest of the men who are fighting under him if he let them know the battle was over. But that wouldn't require, he could have captured Absalom and done the same thing. So what we should conclude, the last time Joab kind of got in trouble with David, it was because he went and murdered the man who killed his brother. Joab does not take family insults lightly. There are all kinds of details. As we've been reading this isn't a very detailed description of events. We're not told exactly how long things took. The movements of troops aren't described in detail, right? So when the Bible in a passage like this gives us details, those details are important. So this detail about who Absalom put in charge of the military was important, and that it was sort of a shot both at Joab and at David to humiliate them. If there's one thing we've learned about Joab so far in 2 Samuel, you don't mess with his family, because if you mess with Joab's family, Joab will have his revenge eventually. And so seems to be the indication that that's why Joab says, forget it. right? I'm killing this guy because he's publicly embarrassed me. He's publicly humiliated me and my mother. And so I'm going to kill him. Verse 17, and they took Absalom and cast him into a large chasm in the thicket, into a great pit, and laid a very large heap of stones over him. Then all Israel fled, everyone to his tent. Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up a pillar for himself in the king's valley. For he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. He called the pillar Absalom's hand, and that is what it is called to this day. So this is another little detail. Now, this isn't as important a detail to us because we don't know exactly where this pillar was, and we're not able to go visit it. But at the time, actually centuries later, that 2 Samuel was written, that until this day means that pillar was still there, right? So we've just read about the end of Absalom. This is a way of reminding us that Absalom died without a son of his own. So that means rebellion over. No one to carry on his part of David's family, but that there is this pillar that he built while he was still alive as sort of a commemoration to him. And it's still there. And we should definitely understand here that this was not sort of a noble burial for the king's son. He's thrown in a ditch and they throw rocks on top of it. So in addition to the way he died in this sort of horrible, violent way, his body is also being disrespected by Joab and his men. So verse 19. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, let me run now and take the good news to the king, how the Lord avenged him from the hand of his enemies. And Joab said to him, you will be no messenger of good news today, for you shall take good news another day. But on this day you shall take no good news on account of the king's son who is dead. And Joab said to Hushai, go tell the king what you saw. And Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said again to Joab, but whatever happens, let me run after the Cushite. So Joab said, my son, why are you going to run? Come here, because you have no good news, which is of use to the one going. And he said, what if I run? So Joab said to him, run. Then Ahimaaz ran by way of Kekar and outran Hushai. So originally, the son of Zadok, the high priest, Ahimaaz, says, I'll go tell David what happened. And Joab says, you don't want to be the one to go tell David what happened. Right? This is it. You may think it's good news that the rebellion's over, but David's not going to see this as good news that his son is dead. You don't want to be the one to tell him. And so he says, Hushai, David's servant. Why? Well, for a couple reasons. We're told, first of all, he's a Cushite, meaning he's a foreigner. So send the foreigner. But also Hushai has this close relationship with David. So Joab's probably also thinking he needs to hear it from someone he's close to. Because Joab obviously knows that when this comes out, there's going to be real heat between him and David for having defied David's orders. But so Ahimaaz goes anyway and ends up running faster than Hushai and getting to David first. Verse 24, now David was sitting between the two gates, and the watchman went up to the top of the gate of the wall and lifted his eyes and looked out. He saw a man running by himself. Then the watchman cried out and told the king, and the king said, if he is alone, there is good news in his mouth. And he came quickly and drew near, right? Because, if it was bad news, if his forces had been routed, he'd have wounded stragglers, what was left of the army coming back. The fact that they just sent a messenger, David's taking to be a positive sign, right? Oh, they must have done well. They must be there mopping up. And so they just sent a messenger back to me. Then the watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called toward the gate and said, there's another man running alone. And the king said, he also brings good news. So he gets where there's two messengers running toward him. We know that the one just outran the other. And so David assumes, wow, there must be a lot of good news, right? They sent one messenger, and then there was more good news. So they had to send somebody else with the next message. Verse 27, so the watchman said, I think the running of the first one resembles the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. And the king said, he is a good man and comes with good news. Right? So as he gets closer, you can kind of see his gait, how he's running. He says, I think that's Ahimaaz. David says, okay, well, Ahimaaz is a good man. This must be good news. And Ahimaaz called out and said to the king, peace. Then he bowed to the king with his face to the earth and said, blessed be the Lord your God, who delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king. Verse 29, the king said, is the young man Absalom safe? So you see, again, for David, his son who betrayed him, who humiliated him, who sent him into exile, that's what he's concerned about. Not a military victory. Is Absalom all right? Ahimaaz answered, I saw a great multitude at the time of Joab sending the king's servant and me, your servant. I saw a great tumult, but I did not know what was happening. And the king said, turn aside and stand here. So he turned aside and stood still. Just then Hushai came, and he said to the king, there is good news, my lord the king, for the Lord avenged you today, and on all those who rose against you. And the king said to Hushai, is the young man Absalom safe? So Hushai answered, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise against you to do harm be like that young man. This is how David finds out that he's dead, right? And the implication there, when he says, may everyone who opposes you, David, end up like Absalom, is not just that Absalom is dead, but that Absalom has died in a violent and horrible way, or a dishonorable way. So time-wise, I know that's a lame place to end for a month, but time-wise, I think this is where we're going to need to end. And so next time we'll pick up in chapter 19 and see how David responds now to what's happened. That now sort of the horror and the nightmare that was unleashed in his family has turned into this sort of horrible tragedy in his family, and how he's going to deal with that and respond to that as a king and as a father and as the head of his household. So that's it for our reading tonight, and we can take questions if anybody's got them. You can either put them in chat or you can unmute. Anyone? Bueller? Were all the people there aware of the commandment not to kill? Well, that's what we were told. We were told David said it to his commanders, but then it immediately said that the people were all, he didn't say it to them privately. He said it to them very publicly, and the word went around. So they were aware that Absalom should not have been killed. Ahimaaz, the text doesn't suggest anywhere that he actually didn't see, so it may be just that he didn't want to be the one to tell David what happened. Even though he got there first, and he sort of took Joab's advice of don't be the guy who tells him this, because he won't see it as good news or be happy. Oh, God's commandment not to kill. Well, yes, right. Obviously, murder was wrong, and so what Absalom was trying to do to his father would constitute murder, assassination. Right, would clearly be against the Torah. Killing in war, right, is not the same thing as murder. What Joab did, though, since Absalom was helpless and couldn't defend himself, hanging there, what Joab did is murder. It was just a revenge murder because Absalom was helpless. He could have taken him captive. He could have let him escape. There are any number of things he could have and should have done rather than murdering him. Thank you, Scott. Someone asked if that's just war theory. No, I wasn't going there. Just, just that killing in war is not the same thing as murder. And Saint Basil the Great says that in his penitential canons. He says killing in war is not the same thing as murder, but he also doesn't say it's fine. He still gave a penance for killing in war because taking another human life is never a good thing. So even if it's done in a war, and of course Israel was commanded in Deuteronomy to only fight defensive wars, even if it's done in a defensive war, when a person takes another human life, that has an effect on their heart and on their soul. And that needs to be healed and needs to be dealt with. Right? So we have to remember repentance and penance and confession isn't about punishing sins. It's about healing the damage caused by sin. And so in a sinful world, sometimes we're exposed to horrible things. Sometimes we have to do things that are tragic and horrible because the alternative is worse, which is why defensive wars were allowed. But even in that circumstance where it's what needs to be done, it still has an effect on us, and that effect has to be healed and purified. And so that was part of the Torah too, is that someone who killed someone else in a war, even if it was a war that God commanded them to go fight, still, if they killed someone, if they drew blood, had to stay outside the camp for this period of time to sort of mourn it and be purified and be restored. So we coined the term post-traumatic stress disorder recently, but it's a real thing that's always been there, that humans were not made to kill each other, regardless of the circumstances. So yeah, I wasn't going into any kind of just war theory or anything like that about when wars are justified. It's just there in the Torah, if we're talking about God's commandments, murder and a soldier killing in the war are both things that are dealt with in terms of cleansing and purification and repentance and forgiveness, but they're not the same thing. Murder is obviously much more horrible and a much greater crime, and is dealt with in a much more serious way. Okay, well, I think then people are saying nice things, which always makes me feel uncomfortable and awkward. But we should probably wrap this one up. So thank you everybody for being here.